In just 2 days, Japan suffered one of the greatest naval disasters in its history. The empire lost more ships than it had at the Battle of Midway and more aircraft than in the previous 6 months of war. Over 50 warships and supply vessels were destroyed, and around 275 Japanese planes were burned or sank into the blue waters of the lagoon. More than 4,500 Japanese sailors and airmen vanished beneath the waves of Truk Lagoon, many of them never to be found again. The most unbelievable part of it all was that the Americans did not lose a single carrier. It was February 1944. The Pacific War had been raging for more than 2 long and bloody years. Islands had changed hands, ships had been lost, and thousands of lives had been taken. But deep in the Caroline Islands, the Imperial Japanese Navy still believed it held control over the Central Pacific. Its fleet rested within a lagoon so large and so heavily protected that Tokyo considered it untouchable. They proudly called it the Gibraltar of the Pacific. But across the ocean, the Americans had a different name for it: the next target. On February 16, 1944, a massive armada gathered in the open Pacific. It was a sight the world had never seen before: an immense force of aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels stretching across the horizon. Their goal was not to capture or occupy land, but to completely destroy Japan's mighty naval base at Truk Lagoon. The operation had been given a fitting name, Hailstone, and when it began, it would forever change the course of naval warfare. The night before the attack, the sea was calm and peaceful. On the Japanese side, sailors aboard their cruisers and destroyers still believed the war was far away. The men wrote letters home, played cards, and watched films beneath a clear sky filled with stars. They had no idea that, over the horizon, 9 American aircraft carriers were silently approaching. These carriers, stationed about 1,500 miles from Hawaii, had their flight decks crowded with planes, and their crews fully prepared for combat. In less than 48 hours, Truk would no longer be a symbol of strength. It would become one of the world's largest underwater graveyards. Truk, now known as Truk, lay hidden deep within the Caroline Islands, and served as the beating heart of Japan's Pacific Empire. Its lagoon stretched nearly 40 miles across, surrounded by volcanic islands and coral reefs that formed a natural fortress. Within that ring of turquoise water, Japan had built one of the most powerful and well-defended naval bases on Earth. Airfields covered the islands of Maui, Etin, and Param. Anti-aircraft guns stood on every ridge, ready to fire at any intruding aircraft. Massive submarine shelters were carved into the rock, while fuel depots, ammunition storage areas, and repair docks lined the shores. For 2 years, this lagoon had served as the main operating base for Japan's combined fleet, the same powerful force that once launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers came here to rest, rearm, and refuel before striking again across the Pacific. Even aircraft carriers used this lagoon as a safe haven. For Japan, Truk was not just a base, it was the pride of the empire, a symbol of military strength and an essential part of its war in the Central Pacific. Tokyo believed that courage, discipline, and sacrifice could hold back the advancing Americans. Every island in their empire was to be defended to the last man. The Japanese military command was convinced that even if the Americans managed to advance, they would suffer heavy losses at every step. From the bloody atolls of Tarawa and Kwailine to the coral sands of Eniwa, Japan intended to make the United States pay for every inch of ground. They believed that over time, the weight of casualties would break America's spirit and force it to withdraw. But while Japan was pouring concrete into bunkers and building airstrips across its islands, America was constructing something far more unstoppably: an industrial machine fueled by steel, oil, and determination. Across the United States, shipyards were working around the clock. Every month, new Essex-class aircraft carriers slid into the water, each larger, faster, and more powerful than any ship Japan could produce. Where Japan relied on bravery and tradition, America relied on production and technology. By early 1944, the balance of power in the Pacific had quietly but completely shifted. Truk, once the most heavily fortified harbor on Earth, had unknowingly become the next domino waiting to fall. Far to the east of Truk, a storm was forming, not of rain or wind, but of metal, fire, and steel. Task Force 58, the most powerful naval strike group ever assembled, sailed toward the Caroline Islands with a single mission: to destroy Japan's main base at Truk and eliminate its fleet once and for all. This mighty force consisted of 9 aircraft carriers, 5 large fleet carriers, and 4 light carriers, supported by 6 battleships, 10 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. More than 500 planes waited on the flight decks, ready to strike at dawn. Each carrier was a floating city, filled with pilots, mechanics, and sailors, all working together like parts of a single, unstoppable machine. Aboard the USS Essex, the night before the attack was tense and restless. The deep hum of engines echoed through the metal corridors. 4 massive turbines pushed out 150,000 horsepower, shaking the ship like a living creature with a steel heart. Mechanics moved silently through the hangar decks, checking fuel lines, loading bombs, and wiping down the wings of the Hellcat fighters and Avenger torpedo bombers. Everyone knew what was coming, but no one spoke of it. Above the decks, the salty air was heavy with anticipation. Pilots ran through their final checks, tightening their straps and inspecting their oxygen masks, while ordnance crews lifted 1,000-pound bombs into place beneath the planes. On the flagship Bunker Hill, Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell studied the weather reports, clear skies and calm seas. Perfect conditions for a surprise attack. Inside the Combat Information Center of the Essex, a young Japanese-American translator listened closely to intercepted enemy radio transmissions from Truk. What he heard was laughter, small talk, and reports of a baseball game and a movie night. It was clear that the Japanese sailors had no idea what was coming. He removed his headset, turned to his commanding officer, and said quietly, "They don't know we're coming." By midnight, every ship in Task Force 58 had taken its position. The flight crews began their final preparations. Fighters started their engines. Bombers were rolled onto the elevators, and the roar of hundreds of propellers filled the night air. The ocean trembled beneath them as the great fleet prepared to unleash its power. Task Force 58 was more than a collection of ships. It was a living machine of war, built for continuous attack. Each carrier operated like a floating factory, moving aircraft from hangar to flight deck to sky in perfect rhythm. As one group of planes launched into the darkness, another was being refueled and armed for the next wave. Every pilot, every mechanic, and every sailor knew their role and carried it out with flawless coordination. The sea that night seemed calm and endless, but just beyond the horizon, a storm of fire and steel was about to descend upon Truk Lagoon, and nothing within its waters would ever be the same again. When one group of American aircraft returned from their attack, another group was already armed, fueled, and waiting on the deck to take off again. There was no pause, no rest, and no hesitation. The plan was simple and absolute: keep the pressure constant until nothing was left standing. There would be no retreat, no mercy, only relentless strikes. At dawn, the American fleet would deliver a blow so devastating that Japan, the empire that once ruled the Pacific with its mighty navy, would finally realize that the age of battleships was over. From this day forward, the future of naval warfare would belong to the aircraft carriers that never slept, the floating fortresses of steel that could project destruction across oceans without ever seeing their enemy face to face. The date was February 17, 1944. In the hours before sunrise, the sky above the Caroline Islands was dark and still, filled only with the quiet hum of tropical insects and the gentle lapping of waves against hulls anchored in Truk Lagoon. For the Japanese sailors on night watch, the world seemed calm and peaceful. The air was heavy but tranquil, and the lagoon glistened faintly beneath the starlight. No one aboard the Japanese ships suspected that within the next few hours, their base, once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, would be reduced to ruins. At 4:30 in the morning, radar operators on the island of Param noticed faint, flickering signals moving toward them from the east. They stared at their screens, confused. The signals were distant and irregular, not strong enough to seem dangerous. Some thought it was just a malfunction. Others suggested it might be a flock of birds or a stray weather echo. No one realized that what they were seeing was the vanguard of the largest aerial assault the Pacific had ever witnessed. A few moments later, the sky to the east erupted in noise and light. From the clouds, 70 F-6F Hellcat fighters came roaring in low, flying just above the waves. Their engines screamed like thunder, and their silhouettes sliced through the pale dawn. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners rushed to their stations, firing wildly into the air. Red and white traces crisscrossed the sky, but the Hellcats were too fast and too low. They raced over the water toward the airfields at Eton Moen and Peram, unleashing a storm of bullets and bombs. Explosions ripped through the hangars. Fuel storage tanks burst open in towering columns of flame. Aircraft parked along the runways ignited one by one, their metal frames melting under the heat. Japanese pilots sprinted across the runways, trying to reach their planes, but many were struck down by gunfire before they could take off. Within minutes, the entire lagoon was echoing with the sound of machine guns, bombs, and exploding fuel. Amid the chaos, A handful of Zero fighters managed to take off. The Japanese pilots, some barely trained, fought with courage and desperation. They twisted and climbed through the smoke-filled sky, trying to defend their base. But their opponents were veterans of countless battles, pilots who had fought over Guadalcanal, Rabaul, and the Solomons. The American Hellcats hunted with deadly precision. They dove from the glare of the rising sun, raking the Zeros with bursts of 6 machine guns. The air became a deadly arena of fire and vapor trails. One by one, the Japanese fighters were torn apart. Many of their pilots had fewer than 100 hours of flying experience, while the Americans had spent months perfecting their combat skills. By mid-morning, Japanese radio transmissions fell silent. 50 planes were destroyed in less than 2 hours, and the air above Truk Lagoon now belonged entirely to the Americans. One U.S. pilot later said it didn't feel like a battle at all. It was a slaughter, he recalled. We owned the sky before they even knew we were there. With the skies secured, the second phase of Operation Hailstone began. Messages spread rapidly across the American fleet. Every ship inside the lagoon was now a target. As the morning mist lifted, the vast lagoon came into view, and it was breathtaking. Floating city of Japanese ships anchored peacefully in the calm blue water. Tankers, cruisers, transports, and destroyers filled the harbor. For 2 years, these ships had kept Japan's Pacific war effort alive, carrying fuel, supplies, and soldiers across thousands of miles. But now, trapped within the coral ring of Truk Lagoon, they had nowhere to run. From the flight decks of the carriers Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, and Bunker Hill, wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes took off. The dauntless dive bombers rolled gracefully into steep descents, releasing their bombs in perfect timing. The Avenger torpedo planes swept in low, their engines roaring as they dropped their deadly loads into the lagoon. The scene below transformed into chaos. Explosions erupted across the water as bombs struck their marks. Enormous plumes of smoke and seawater shot hundreds of feet into the air. Ships burned, broke apart, and disappeared beneath the surface. Lieutenant Frank Lawler, piloting a Dauntless, spotted a large ship below him, the Rio de Janeiro Maru, a former passenger liner converted into a naval transport. He released his 1,000-pound bomb at the perfect moment. The explosion split the ship open, flames and debris shooting skyward. Within hours, the once proud vessel rolled onto her side and sank beneath the waves, leaving only bubbles and oil on the water's surface. Nearby, the submarine tender Heian Maru was struck multiple times. A series of explosions ripped through her decks, detonating torpedoes and ammunition, sending massive fireballs into the sky. Across the lagoon, destruction spread like wildfire. Tankers erupted in flames, their oil spilling into the sea and feeding the inferno. Ammunition ships exploded in bursts so bright that American pilots felt the heat inside their cockpits. One pilot described the lagoon as a boiling cauldron of smoke and flame. The once tranquil waters were now black and churning, covered in wreckage. From miles away, the crews aboard the American carriers could see towers of smoke rising like dark columns into the sky. Japanese radio operators called out desperately for help, but their messages went unanswered. The main body of Japan's fleet, its battleships and remaining carriers, had withdrawn weeks earlier to Palau. Truk was isolated, and no reinforcements were coming. Still, the Americans showed no mercy. While one squadron attacked, another was already refueling and rearming. The carriers operated like perfectly tuned machines. Every few minutes, another formation of planes roared off the decks, their engines blending into the rhythm of the sea. By midday, more than 20 Japanese ships were sinking or burning, yet the attack continued. Radar screens soon showed new blips to the North enemy, warships trying to flee. Admiral Mark Mitcher immediately ordered his forces to intercept them. To the north of Truk, the light cruiser Katori led a small group of ships, including the destroyers Mikaze and Nawaki, and the auxiliary ship Akagi Maru. They were racing through open water at full speed, desperate to escape, but their path took them straight into the guns of 2 American giants, the battleships Iowa and New Jersey, accompanied by cruisers and destroyers. For the first time in the Pacific War, America's most powerful battleships would fire their 16-inch guns at enemy vessels. When the order came, the sea itself seemed to shudder. The Iowa and New Jersey unleashed their full broadsides. Massive shells, each weighing more than a ton, screamed through the air, trailing smoke and thunder. Moments later, Katori was struck. The first shells tore through her hull, blowing apart her bridge and killing dozens instantly. Still, her crew refused to surrender. They launched torpedoes in desperation, but the deadly projectiles missed their targets and vanished into the sea. A second volley from Iowa hit Katori's bow, nearly ripping it off. Another shell smashed into her engine room, stopping her dead in the water. She burned fiercely, her hull glowing red as the sea foamed around her. Nearby, Mikaze fought on, until she was engulfed in a massive explosion, disappearing in a ball of fire. Naoki escaped into the smoke, laying a screen of cover behind her. She was the only survivor of the group. The men aboard the American battleships watched in silence. There was no celebration, no cheering. They simply stood and watched as Katori rolled over and sank, her remains swallowed by the dark sea. By the end of the day, the horizon glowed with fire from east to west. The blue waters of Truk Lagoon were blackened with oil and ash. Wrecked ships drifted half-submerged, their bows rising from the water like monuments of defeat. Smoke blotted out the sun, and the air smelled of burning fuel and twisted metal. The sailors aboard the American carriers stood on deck, watching quietly as the fortress of Truk crumbled into ruin. Operation Hailstone had turned Japan's greatest naval base into a graveyard beneath the sea. But even after night fell, the Americans didn't stop. New waves of bombers took off into the dark, targeting anything that still moved: warehouses, fuel dumps, runways, and hidden supply depots. Throughout the long tropical night, the fires burned without pause, lighting up the lagoon like a hellish inferno. For the Japanese soldiers trapped on the islands, it was the longest and most terrifying night of their lives. By dawn, the once proud base that had symbolized Japan's naval might was gone. By evening, Truk Lagoon had become an ocean of fire and wreckage. Columns of smoke climbed high into the clouds, and the orange glow could be seen from more than 100 miles away. A burning reminder that the era of Japan's naval dominance in the Pacific had come to a violent and final end. Through the long night, the American carriers remained alive with movement and purpose. The sea was dark, the decks dimly lit by lanterns as sailors worked tirelessly. Bombs were rolled out and loaded by hand, planes were refueled, and mechanics checked every bolt and cable in preparation for another strike before sunrise. There was no confusion or panic, only a steady rhythm of men and machines working together like parts of a great living organism. Every carrier had its task. When one ship launched its aircraft, another guided returning planes back onto its deck. When one crew rearmed, another refueled. It was an endless cycle, perfectly timed, perfectly practiced. Below deck, the heart of the fleet kept beating. Sailors scrubbed oil from their hands after long hours in the engine rooms. Cooks worked through the night, serving meals to keep the crews fed. Doctors moved quickly to treat injured pilots who had crash-landed in the sea. Everyone had a purpose, and together they kept the momentum alive. This was more than a fleet, it was a living system, a force that could not be stopped. When dawn broke on February 18th, the final waves of the attack began. Avengers and dauntless bombers filled the sky once more, sweeping over the lagoon to finish off what was left. Every ship still afloat, every hangar that still stood, every storehouse that had escaped the first day's destruction was targeted again and again, until all that remained was wreckage and flame. When the last American aircraft returned to its carrier, the air was still and the sea was quiet. The once mighty lagoon was now a graveyard, holding more than 50 sunken ships and hundreds of destroyed planes. But Japan had lost far more than steel and oil. It had lost an idea, the belief that courage alone could hold back a nation built on endurance and production. The world had entered a new kind of war, one that would be decided not by a single grand battle, but by systems, supply lines, and the ability to keep fighting without rest. The relentless rhythm born at Truk spread across the Pacific like a tide. The same fleets, the same ships, and the same crews pushed onward to new targets. From the Marshalls to the Marianas, each stronghold of Japan's empire fell one after another. Kwilin was taken, then Japan's outer defenses collapsed island by island. Meanwhile, beneath the waves, American submarines began cutting off the empire's lifelines. In 1944 alone, more than 600 Japanese ships were sunk. Nearly 3 million tons of vital cargo, oil, steel, and food could no longer reach the factories and garrisons that needed them. Japan's once powerful outposts became isolated prisons, surrounded by the vast, empty sea. As this happened, Task Force 58 itself transformed into something the world had never seen before. It became a self-sustaining war machine, a fleet that could fight forever. Fleet oilers refueled warships at sea. Ammunition ships delivered bombs straight to the flight decks, and repair vessels patched holes without ever returning to port. When Admiral Spruance's 5th Fleet rested, Admiral Halsey's 3rd Fleet took command of the same ships and crews, continuing the fight without pause. The Japanese called it a fleet with two heads. In truth, it was a fleet that never slept. Still, Japan held on to one final hope, a decisive battle that might change the course of the war. That battle came in June 1944, west of the Marianas. Admiral Gisaburo Ozawa led 9 carriers with 400 aircraft, determined to stop the Americans once and for all. Facing him, Task Force 58 now had 15 carriers and more than 900 planes. When Japanese aircraft appeared on radar, American controllers calmly directed their fighters to intercept. What followed was a massacre. Within hours, over 300 Japanese planes were shot down at the cost of only 29 American aircraft. Pilots called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the end of the day, the Japanese fleet was shattered. The carriers Taiho Shokaku and Hio burned and sank beneath the waves. With them died Japan's last chance for air supremacy. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant strategists, later wrote, "The enemy fights with machines that never tire. We fight for one day, they fight forever." From that moment on, Japan's navy would never again go on the offensive. Its remaining carriers, stripped of trained pilots and starved of fuel, became hollow symbols of a vanished power. The machine that had begun its rise at Trek now ruled the Pacific. 18 months later, the war was over. On September 2, 1945, Tokyo Bay lay quiet beneath a gray sky. The battleship Missouri stood anchored, its decks crowded with officers from both sides, as the final act of surrender took place. Not far away, the carrier Essex floated peacefully, her aircraft folded and silent. For the men who had fought since those burning days at Truk, it was an ending almost beyond comprehension. The thunder of engines, the chaos of battle, the endless work of launching and landing, all had fallen silent. One sailor wrote in his journal, "We built something new, not just ships or planes, but a way of fighting that never stopped, a way of winning that never rested." He was right. The Essex-class carriers had not only helped end the war, they had reshaped the future of naval warfare. From the carriers that followed Forrestal Enterprise, Nimitz, the legacy lived on. Power at sea would no longer be measured by how many guns a ship carried, but by how many planes it could launch at dawn. Yet victory had come at a terrible cost. More than 36,000 Americans died in the Central Pacific Campaign. On the Japanese side, over 300,000 soldiers and civilians perished. Many fought to the last, or starved on isolated islands, refusing to surrender. Today, Truk Lagoon lies silent again. Beneath its calm turquoise waters rest the rusting remains of destroyers, tankers, and submarines. Coral has claimed their decks, and fish drift through the ghostly corridors where once engines roared and men shouted orders. For divers, it is a haunting world frozen in time. For historians, it is a monument to a moment when the tide of history turned forever. At Truk, the age of battleships ended, and the aircraft carrier became more than a weapon. It became the embodiment of a nation's will and endurance. It was not just a victory, it was a transformation. War had become a system, and endurance had proven stronger than bravery alone. Asterisk.